Christians are always talking about inerrancy. They'll talk about the Bible as inerrant. It's without error. You know, it's the message of God. If God, a perfect being, giving a message to us, should be without error. If there was an error in the Bible, if some part of the Bible wasn't true, we could kind of assume that it must have come from somewhere other than God, because God, a perfect being, could not give us an imperfect message, or a message that contains something that was not true. So inerrancy is very important to many Christians, and many Christians will talk about inerrancy as being almost like a quasi-foundational belief. But if you talk to a skeptic, someone who's not a Christian, they'll love to tell you that there are thousands of errors in the Bible. It's not just that they disagree with the content or message of the Bible. They'll talk about the problems with the text itself. You know, we can look back at the ancient copies of the Bible that we use to create our modern day translations, and that there'll be thousands of textual problems. We can look at copies of the Bible and know that the wording in that book, in that copy, was not the original message of the original author. There's problems with the Bible. So what do Christians mean then, if there are thousands of problems, if there's thousands of errors? What do we mean by inerrancy? I mean, the fact is that there are thousands of errors, of variants in our Bible manuscripts. So what do we mean when we're talking about inerrancy? Well, I think it's important for us to think about what we're actually saying. The claim here by the Christian would be that the original message of God is without error. The thing that God wanted to communicate through the writers of the Bible, that message contained no errors, that God was truthful and accurate about what he said about himself, about human nature, about the way in which we should reunite with him, the things that he'd like us to do, the way he'd like us to live. That original message is without error. We're not claiming that later books, later copies of the Bible could not in some way corrupt or bring error into later copies of the Bible. Let's use some modern day examples. You know, famously, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of America, was not that crazy about certain portions of the Bible. In fact, he produced his own version of the Bible where he made some changes to certain portions to better fit his own theological views about God and who God is and what he's like. We also saw in America a Bible called the Slave Bible. This was a Bible that was produced by slave owners to give to their slaves. Huge portions of the Bible were redacted, removed from these copies of the Bible. Portions of the New Testament that talk about us all being brothers and sisters in Christ, taken out. The story of Exodus about the Jewish slaves of ancient times escaping slavery, taken out. These slave owners didn't want their slaves reading this stuff from the Bible that might encourage them to rebel or might suggest that they should not be slaves, that they are equal to their masters. Obviously, we would not say that these are threats to inerrancy. The fact that 1800 years after the Bible is written, somebody comes and changes the Bible does not threaten inerrancy, right? Because the goal or the claim of inerrancy is that the original message had no error, not that no one can ever create an error later in history. Well, the big problem we have with the Bible is that we don't have any original manuscripts. We don't have the original copies of any biblical book. Some of these biblical books, especially the Old Testament, are very ancient. But even the New Testament is still, that's still 2,000 years ago. We do not have the original copies. Scholars, even scholars who are not Christians, don't really see that as being necessarily surprising. A lot of people kind of suggest that maybe these copies were just used so often by so many churches over such a long time that they eventually wore out or essentially disintegrated, fell apart. But maybe the originals exist somewhere, and maybe through some future archaeology, maybe we'll find them. That would be I would like to see that, but we don't have any originals, and we don't know that we ever will. The originals may have just been destroyed over time. But that's what we're trying to get back to. We're trying to get the original message of God. But how do we accomplish that if we have no originals? Well, we use copies. We know that the Bible, after the original is written, many copies are made. You especially see that in the early Christian church. Paul one of the apostles will write a letter to a church. That might be their first bit of Christian literature about Jesus. That's what they're reading in church, but they're also going to make copies, do their best to get a word-for-word accurate copy, and then they're going to share that with the next church in the next town over, and these copies are slowly getting spread. So now we have lots of copies of the same book being shared amongst all the Christians. And over time, copies are continuing to be made, and the people making the copies are scribes. They're people who are attempting to copy as best they can. Their goal is to have every copy be exactly word for word like the original. In fact, some scribes would try to keep it exact in terms of how many letters were on every line of a book, how many sentences, how many lines were going to be on each page, so that it would be as close to a photocopy as you could get in ancient times. However, throughout time, errors crept into the texts. We see the majority, the vast majority, come down to spelling. Words will be spelled a little bit differently at different time periods, almost like the way that American English and English in Britain have different spellings, like the word color may or may not contain a U depending on where you're looking at. It is a variation or an error. Maybe a letter was or was not included in the original, but it doesn't drastically change the message. Actually, it doesn't change the message at all. So while we could consider this an error, the text is different than maybe the original text. The original message still comes through. Even if there was an issue where there was a complete sentence added or subtracted in a copy, we have so many copies that we're able to compare and contrast. And so when there are errors, we know about them because of how many copies we have. We have more copies of the Bible, ancient copies of the Bible, than any other ancient book. It's not even close. I mean, we have thousands of copies of the Old and New Testament, and we can compare these. So even if we had only 5 copies of a book, we can compare what they all look like, and we can see where the discrepancies are. So we're going to do our best to figure out, okay, based on the copies we have, what did the original say? This is something that is accomplishable, even if every copy was incorrect in some small way. If the error is in a different place, we can, by comparison, figure out what was the original trying to communicate. The biggest thing I think we all need to think about is that no variant, no textual change, problem, however we want to describe it, changes theological points. Through the ancient copies of the Bible, we can clearly know what the original authors were trying to communicate and what the original Christians thought it said. You know, the original Christians also wrote about Christianity, even quoted portions of the Bible. So we can see not only what the Bible was originally communicating, but what early Christians thought about the Bible. So when we talk about inerrancy, we're not talking about everything was always perfect. Nobody ever made a mistake. Nobody ever tried to change the Bible. What we're saying is that we can identify and reconstruct the original message of the Bible authors. We know what they were trying to communicate, and what they are trying to communicate is without error. That original message is from God, and we treat that as truth. If God said it, it's true because God is a perfect being. He's all-knowing, and if He said it, then it must be true. That is the meaning of inerrancy. So I don't want us to be scared when we hear about errors in the Bible, textual variants. This does not affect inerrancy. Inerrancy would refer to the original message. What we're trying to get back to is the original message, and we have so many copies that it is very easy to identify, to reconstruct what the originals must have said.